yours.
Thank you very much, Hans. First of all, I'd like to explain what the title of my talk actually means. What, if I can make the slides move, here we go. The idea is that currently electricity consumers have very little control over the electricity system. This is in spite of, in many countries, liberalization policies which suggest that the main decisions will be taken by markets and the consumers will be able to influence those markets. In practice, governments or system operators make almost all of the key decisions. Consumers have virtually no control over them, and they just have to pay for whatever is decided. What I'm going to argue today is that this is changing, and that we should be preparing to move to a new decentralized, decarbonized system where customers have a significant degree of control over the process. There are 4 parts to my presentation. The first is to explain how changing economics and technology in the sector is enhancing the role of the consumer and of demand flexibility. The second explains how the incentives and the ability of consumers to participate is growing, especially the economic incentives. The third is to look at what I call the political calculus, where governments now have more of an interest in passing responsibility to consumers and also have more of an interest in relying on competitive markets than they do right now. The final part is where I outline my proposal for what you might call a new paradigm, a new framework, policy guidelines to deliver the kind of decentralized, decarbonized electricity system that I have in mind. Let me move then immediately to the first of these arguments. As a result of the penetration of intermittent renewable energy and new ICT technologies, the system is basically being turned upside down. And there are many different, let's see how I change that. Yeah, there are many important features, but I just want to focus on those that have specifically to do with the role of consumers. The first is called the generation structure. I'll use, again, here we go. The generation structure used to be, and still is to a large extent, mainly centralized with large generators, with often fossil-fired and flexible, as well as being firm. Now we're moving to a system where energy generation is decentralized, usually renewable, and often on people's rooftops. So already we can see a change in the structure and if you want, the influence that decentralized generation and consumers will have. The second is down near the bottom, called role of demand side. We're moving from one which is passive, where consumers don't really have much control or don't really respond very quickly to price signals, to one where they're interactive, either responding to price signals or even selling services to the system. But the one I think is most important here is the one called planning and operation. It really is what the guts of the system. In the existing or old system, flexible supply, that is generation which was flexible, was used to match uncertain demand. But as the intermittent renewables penetrate the system, if you want, the generation supply is no longer firm, flexible, or dispatchable. And on the contrary, we have to now move to a system where flexible demand is used to match the uncertain supply. Let me look a little bit further at that issue of dealing with the balance between supply and demand. We're now moving to a new type of flexible demand. It's always, the demand response, it was called, has always been important because there was a recognition that consumers could be interrupted in order to reduce demand, say at times of system peak or at times of system stress. What we're talking about now, though, is what I would call a two-way flexibility. That is to consume more or consume less depending on renewable output. We're also talking about real-time flexibility, not a predictable type of flexibility. We know the peak will be on, in the evening, and we can therefore shift our demand to a different time. We're talking about intermittency, which could be from 1 minute to the next, and where we need to be able to respond that quickly. We're also talking about flexibility which responds not just to system-wide problems or challenges, but to local ones. So when the clouds are in a particular area or arrive in an area, it may mean less solar energy, and we need to have some flexibility to cope with that. And we're moving from a situation where the large customers were providing flexibility to one where as many customers as possible are doing. So the problem we face is that the current system does not provide incentives to provide this type of demand flexibility, which is why we're having this conversation. Now, I'm just going to give you one glimpse of the future, the sort of problems which we can anticipate being more and more frequent if we don't develop the kind of flexibility I'm talking about. And that was the California outages in August. I'm not talking about those that had to do with fires or avoiding forest fires. I'm talking about those that had to do with a shortage of generation or energy supply to meet demand. These shortages happened after the sun went down, so in the evening, but consumption as a result of the air conditioning needed to cope with the hot weather continued. So we ended up with a shortage of generation to meet the demand. And normally what would happen is that there would be the potential for generation from, say, gas-fired plants or imports to fill the gap. But in this case, that was not available, partly because in neighboring states there were also problems of supply. So what really should have happened is that a significant amount of demand should have been reduced, or demand should have shifted to a previous period. But what happened instead was a planned rolling outages, meaning that the system operator, CAISO, decided in advance to protect the system that they would cut off consumers. This is a very good example of where the system is not designed to avoid outages, and in fact, it requires consumers to accept the lack of, if you want, of a system response by way of having to be cut off. So this is a good example of not having control, where there is opportunities for consumers have provided that control by being flexible in their demand. Let me then move on to the second section, which is about changing consumer incentives. I want to argue essentially that there are three reasons to expect consumers to be more active and to play a greater role in future. Each of them has an economic incentive, but there are other incentives as well. The first has to do with the growth and declining costs of behind-the-meter resources and digitization. The second has to do with the rising value of flexibility to the system. And the third has to do with a combination of commercial and social models that facilitate active competition or consumption. On the first, what we see is, well, let me just show you a picture. We've got here the IEA's forecast for future capacity growth between 2019 and 2024. And what we see at the bottom, solar PV is clearly the largest of these. We're talking about 700 gigawatts, which is a significant share of global generation. And of that, almost half of it is in distributed PV, which includes, among others, rooftop solar. So it's growing very significantly. And now there are various reasons for this, but I want to focus on one in particular. If you look at this graphic on the left-hand side, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but there's a red dot here, which is the price that consumers pay for buying electricity from the system. And then there is a blue bar here for the cost of rooftop solar or distributed PV. Now, you can see here in Germany, and you can see also in Australia, a significant gap between price paid for system energy and the cost of distributed PV. There's an obvious incentive here to generate oneself rather than to buy from the system. If you look out a few more years to 2024, the IEA forecasts this green bar. So we see the cost of rooftop PV falling, and therefore the gap becoming greater. If you look over on the right-hand side, we see not only is the cost falling, but here what we see is the price that you're paying for electricity is rising. Now this is in the EU, and it's for an earlier period from 2008 to 2015. But what I want to point out is not only are those prices rising, making it even more likely that consumers will want to generate their own electricity, but we're also seeing that this green bar, this green part of the bar is taxes and levies, okay? Which means that consumers are, through the signals they're receiving in domestic tariffs, being given an incentive to invest in rooftop solar rather than to buy from the system. So that's one incentive. Let me look at a second incentive, which is the rising value of flexibility to balance the system. As I mentioned before, as a result of penetration of renewable, intermittent renewables, there's a change in the way we balance the system, but there's also a need to do more balancing because of the intermittency. What this graph shows us is the quarterly average cost of balancing the power system in the UK as a percentage of the cost of generation. So in 2010, it was less than 5%. In fact, it looks more like about 2.5% of generation cost. And by 2020, it was well over 20%. Now, we anticipate that this could easily rise a lot more, maybe to 50%, as intermittent renewables become more important and as the need to balance the system becomes more expensive. So since demand flexibility, for instance, through use of batteries or smart devices, is going to be one of the ways in which the system controls for the balance or balances the system, it's going to be a source of revenue for people who own those resources. So that's a second incentive. The third is the effect of new business models, in particular the role of aggregators, who buy flexibility from multiple consumers, package it, and then resell energy and flexibility into markets. And this obviously can be attractive for consumers if it lowers their bill, if it provides them, as it does often, detailed information about their consumption, if it has environmental attributes, and it also is an alternative to buying from traditional suppliers. It's attractive for the system because it lowers the cost of obtaining access to demand flexibility, and it also entails competition for existing generation, bringing down the costs for everyone. So this is another, if you want, facilitator. A final one I want to mention here is energy communities. These are formed by citizens who agree to share, invest in and share energy generation, storage, distribution, supply optimization, and sometimes trading. It's attractive to many consumers and citizens because, again, it offers some potential to avoid certain elements of the system price. It also involves regaining control from the existing utilities, and there are important environmental and social goals as well. The attractiveness to the system is it enables the system to gain access to some of the flexibility from these consumers. In effect, the energy community acts as a kind of an aggregator. So I should add that these communities may also enhance system security of supply in a system which is increasingly decentralized. So that's the end of the first two parts. We understand the importance now, growing importance of demand flexibility in consumers. We understand now the increased incentives and potential for consumers to participate. I now want to look at what I call the changing political calculus. And that has two parts. The first has to do with governments needing consumers and citizens to participate in the energy transition. First of all, because they realize that consumer demand flexibility is now an essential part of the new decarbonized electricity system. But they now also realize that in order to achieve serious reductions in emissions, they have to reduce emissions of oil and gas products in heating, in transport. And therefore, this is going to require significant investments by consumers, by citizens, in, for instance, new smart electric vehicles with smart charging, heat pumps, and other equipment that can be adjusted to respond to price signals in the market. In order for consumers to buy in and agree to make those investments, they have to be willing to participate, and governments have to make it worth their while. There's also a political objective, which is to ensure that there is political support for the energy transition. We've seen in France with the Gilets jaunes, with the yellow jackets, how a citizen revolt could undermine attempts to introduce what are considered to be very unpopular policies. And I should say that this is not just about trying to convince them to live with whatever the government has decided. It is to learn from them, because they are a source of information about their preferences, what they're willing to do, how they value reliability from the system, or how little they rely on it. So I think it's important to understand that this political support for the energy transition requires consumers and citizens to participate in the process and to be actively involved in the designing of the policies which are going to be implemented. There's a second element to this calculus, and it has to do with what I call the political calculus on liberalization. And this is an idea that was initially introduced by Alfred Kahn, who was a professor at Cornell and the chairman of the New York Public Service Commission. He noted, and I think he hypothesized, but based upon his own experience, which I think was accurate, that there were different political reactions to the idea of competition depending on the relationship between the existing costs of the system and the costs of future system. And what he argued was that if the future system, think the renewable system, is more expensive than the old system, the existing system, then in that case, governments would intervene. They would intervene partly to make sure that the plants that they wanted got built, so that renewables got built even though markets would not have built them, and to limit and control the way in which those costs are passed on in prices. And that we've seen. On the other hand, he said, when the marginal costs of expanding the system are lower than the costs of the existing system, then governments would be inclined to favor competition and liberalization because it will accelerate the process of reducing prices, which consumers and citizens will favor. So I will argue, and I'm arguing, that with declining costs of renewables, we can anticipate that governments will be more favorable towards competitive processes, and also that those competitive processes will include consumers for the reasons that I've just summarized. Let me now pass to the last section of the presentation, which is to introduce elements of what I call the new paradigm of distributed power. But we're really talking here about a set of guidelines or recommendations for establishing a new framework for the electricity system to support decarbonized, decentralized electricity with consumers very much leading the process. Again, this is not a complete set of guidelines, but they are what I think are key messages. The first one has to do with efficient prices and market access. The second has to do with what I call behavioral incentives. The third is the importance of innovation and experimentation. The fourth has to do with managing the risks of non-alignment between the interests of the consumer and the interests of the system. And the final one is a proposed new market design, which we call the two-market approach. First of all, I think we all know how expensive decarbonization will be. And we all should, or I assume we do, recognize the importance of having efficient prices that reflect changing costs on the system. Now, I won't go into the detail of fiscal policy reform, tariff reform, market reform, but I will say that in a market where so many of the payments are happening outside of the market through feed-in tariffs or through extra payments that are not earned in the market no longer reflects the true costs of the system. So we need to reform the market so that it's actually providing price signals that are sensible and that do not exclude a lot of the non-market transactions, because otherwise the market, in that case, if it excludes all of those transactions, the market no longer provides efficient signals for investment, operations, consumption, or anything else. The main point then is that we want efficient prices. We also want market access, because if we have efficient prices, say, in the market, then it doesn't matter if consumers and their representatives have no access to that market. Today, there are many wholesale markets which were designed, of course, for the old system and large-scale generators, but they were not designed for consumers to participate in them. They will need to be reformed. But at the very least, what is needed is consumers must be given the right to enter and give access to those markets, or at least their representatives, in the form of aggregators. I think it's also important to realize that new markets are going to be needed. I would stress especially the importance of, on the distribution network, of developing local congestion markets. That is because with the growth of distributed energy resources, whether it's in houses or industrial complexes, the flows on the distribution network have become more complex. Instead of them flowing in one direction from distant generation to consumers, now there's going to be generation and consumption and changes in both right on the distribution network, creating periods of congestion which have to be managed. Consumers, in those markets that can be set up to manage this, consumers with their behind-the-meter assets can participate in auctions or markets to provide the flexibility needed to relieve the congestion. A second issue, as I mentioned before, are behavioral incentives. I think we have to, as economists have learned that prices, although they are very important, they're not the only factor that determines how consumers behave. In fact, behavioral issues include so many factors that prices often become significantly less relevant. I mentioned loss aversion to losing money, confidentiality concerns about control of one's devices, comfort, and also just understanding how the system works. These can affect not only willingness of consumers to, if you want, invest in the sorts of behind-the-meter devices that are needed to provide flexibility, for instance, like a smart electric boiler, but they also will affect the ability of those consumers to manage those devices in a way that actually provides efficient flexibility to the system, and which will help them to minimize their costs. There's a recent article by Sarah Darby of the Environmental Change Institute at Oxford University, which emphasizes in particular the role of technology and communication strategies to engage users. She was referring to a demonstration project in a number of European countries that was introducing smart electric boilers and trying to ascertain how the consumers reacted to using these, how efficiently they did it, what was the best way for them to do it well. And she came up with three C's as three strategies, which she thought should be introduced by policymakers, by whoever it is that's introducing these these new ideas. One was she called connectivity, which had to do with the interactions between technologies and software architecture. I think it was as simple as to say that if the software was updated but it didn't any longer speak properly to the hardware, then obviously the system wouldn't work. These are so basic, but they're very important to make sure they're working. The second she calls control, and it has to do with interactions between people and technology. And there we're talking mainly about, for instance, a consumer having a user-friendly app or some easy to understand means of controlling the technology which is working for them. And the third is called care, and it has to do with interactions between people. And here we're talking primarily about users and those who help to install the equipment and explain how it works. It's okay to have a help desk online, but an awful lot of people, especially older people who may not know how to go online or don't understand what's being said, need much more patience and clarity in communicating how something should and shouldn't work. She refers to one instance where one consumer wanted to save money, but rather than following if you want the guidance, they turned off the electric boiler most of the day. They turned it on when they needed it, but that's of course when the price was highest. So in other words, there's a real, it's really important to have taken care of the interactions between people. So in short, the behavioral issues can be important as the efficient price signals. I want also to stress the importance of innovation and experimentation. I mean, we're talking about something which is all very new, especially when it comes to small consumers. There will be a need to experiment with different regulations, for instance, different tariff designs, with different market designs. There's going to be new markets, that, for instance, the local congestion markets. There are going to be new products. We're going to have to be thinking how consumers get access to them. There's going to have to also be innovation in technology to connect with consumers, optimization programs to optimize the use of all of their behind the meter technologies, and to then optimize from the point of view of the aggregator, thousands of different devices. And we're going to need also innovation in the development of social, like energy communities, and business models like aggregation. All of these are new innovations, and the government, in many different ways, is able to support this and should support this innovation. For instance, it could provide financial support for R&D, especially if it's early staging R&D. There are policy spillovers, benefits which justify public support for this. They could be actively involved in developing an industrial strategy, public-private partnership, for instance, an industrial strategy to connect the renewable generation with the electric vehicle charging, smart charging of electric vehicles. They could be financing the training for users of these equipment. And they could be using their what we often refer to as regulatory sandboxes or regulatory pilots to experiment with new combinations of policy, technology, and business models in conditions where current regulations wouldn't allow it, but where there's no harm done in relaxing those restrictions to experiment. I see energy communities being a particularly good example of where one could be experimenting. I want also to mention the importance of non-alignment. That is, there's a risk that consumers may take decisions which raise systems costs. If they decide to generate electricity at a cost which is much higher than the cost of building some new renewable next door or somewhere else, and they do this in order to avoid paying, say, some of the policy costs, then essentially they're raising the overall costs of renewable energy for the system, and they're passing the cost to some other consumer or taxpayer. So we don't really want that. We can also see examples where the system raises costs. For instance, in California by not having a incentive to encourage demand flexibility when the sun goes down. They end up imposing blackouts on consumers who would have been willing to change their consumption pattern if they'd been given an incentive to do so. So there are three different specific ways in which I think that if you want real risks of non-alignment, particularly where consumers are imposing costs. One is whether hidden subsidies, which lead to the consumer leaving. In that case, rather than encourage that, the remedy might be to make any subsidies explicit and limited in time, and also to tariff reform to minimize the distortionary effect. Balkanization is another important one, where energy communities decide that they would like to isolate themselves from the system. This can raise community costs if it turns out that their community is more expensive than the system, than using energy from the system. And it could raise system costs for the same reason that I mentioned before when people leave the existing system. The remedies for that, I think, are to give consumers the freedom to leave a community, which is a discipline on the community to be efficient and probably better connected with the system, and also to give opportunities and benefits for integration to the energy communities. And the final one here is the consumer losing control. That is, when consumers' devices are remotely controlled, this is effectively the system deciding how consumers should use their devices rather than the consumer doing so. This can cause problems. It may increase the cost for the system because there may have been other consumers willing to do something more cheaply. It also can cause problems for the consumer that is unhappy with the decision that was taken with the remote control. There are different remedies, including commercial options for consumer control and the right always to override decisions being taken externally. Let me now talk about the proposed new market that Malcolm Kay and I have been developing. Malcolm is a colleague at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. I'll use the cursor. I don't know if you can see it, but on the top, we've got what's called on-demand flexible generators. These are mainly fossil-fired coal and gas, traditional generation stations that are dispatchable. These in this model will continue to operate as they do now. They will be paid every 50, on the basis of the marginal cost of the system every 15 minutes. And the marginal cost of the system whenever the price is set will also include a carbon price. So those prices will be volatile and they will rise over time. Over here, we've got what we call as available generators, intermittent generators that run whenever they run. There are intermittent renewable generators that are not firm or dispatchable. They just run when they are available. Over here, we've got support for low carbon generators. This may not be necessary. Basically here, instead of being paid an hourly price that fluctuates, these are going to be paid a fixed price per kilowatt hour always, and it's not going to be affected by the price in the other market. So this is going to be flat. It's not going to be affected by the carbon price. And as initially, it may need support, but the idea is that this will be a cheaper, flatter alternative. And that if you want the price you pay for buying this is that it's intermittent, it isn't certain. Now, the operator will dispatch both of them as they do now. And these one will probably go first because there's zero marginal cost and these will come later. But basically, it doesn't change the operation. The electricity then comes through to consumers. Consumers also there are some consumption which is called on demand. And so essentially in this consumption, we're not talking about different molecules. We're talking about this is a contractual arrangement. They're going to pay the same price as these people receive, essentially. So we're ignoring the cost of transport. They're going to see the same fluctuation in prices as the generators see here. Whereas this consumption is for consumers who are going to have a commercial agreement which enables them to buy generation at the fixed kilowatt hour average cost of the renewables, which, as I say, will be flat and will not be affected by the CO2 price. But these, when we call as available consumption, what we mean is that those consumers will have to consume it when, at the time it's being generated. If they do not do so, if they're consuming outside of the times when these generators are generating, they're essentially buying electricity from the on-demand market. Okay, now I know if people have questions, I'm sure you will, but I'm happy to explain. But let me look at the key benefits of this market. The first is that it lowers emissions. And it does that because the incentive is there for consumers to use as available renewable energy as much as possible whenever it is available. And that could be to either actually use it or to store it for use later. It gives them an incentive to limit the need for on-demand fossil energy, which has a high and volatile price, and which they will have to pay if they are consuming energy outside the periods when as available renewable energy is available. Second set of incentives benefits is the efficient level of security of supply. Because what's happening is that consumers are indicating their preference regarding their reliance on the system to meet their needs. So for instance, if the consumer decides not to buy from the on-demand system, it's saying, I don't need you to buy or build assets to meet my demand because I have decided to either rely on my own generation or to buy as available generation to have storage. In any case, it's sending a signal, which means that when governments, system operators start to make decisions about what needs to be built, they recognize that there are consumers who don't need that supply in the way that they used to have to pay for it. Now, the other is that we've got consumers who buy on-demand energy. They are the only ones who are responsible for the cost of that energy. So to the extent that they are responsible for it, they are going to pay for it. And this is important for another reason I'll explain in a minute. But in addition to these benefits, we've got incentives to invest in flexibility resources, such as batteries and flexible smart devices. And we also have the add-on that this will create a supply chain of services, technologies, equipment to support demand flexibility. These supply chains will potentially be global markets, lead to global markets, and be a way for demand flexibility to become a widely adopted policy throughout the world. One final benefit is that it provides an exit strategy for renewable subsidies and for capacity support. Well, why is that? Because to begin with, if this is not attractive enough for consumers to want to contract for it immediately, there will be support until such time as this really is attractive enough to be, if you want, for consumers to want to buy it. So the idea here is that once this is no longer needed, it will disappear. So this is if you want, the subsidy, which will no longer be needed. It will disappear. But as you know, right now, the penetration of renewables has dropped the price of electricity so far that now it's very difficult to justify investing in this type of plant. But in future, only the people who consume it will be responsible for paying for it. And since there will be an alternative to avoid paying for it, these consumers should pay for it, and it will be easier politically to allow prices in this market to rise to levels that justify the investment. So it will both reduce or allow for the elimination of the subsidies on renewables when they are no longer needed, and allow also eventually for the removal of capacity payments to pay for new firm capacity. Um, I'm aware that and we are both aware that this requires quite a substantial change, and so what we have done is to develop sort of a list of partial implementation strategies, which would draw on individual elements, but deliver benefits without major disruption. And particularly, we were interested in the idea of incentives to consume as available energy. For instance, within an energy community, where they're generating their own electricity, they can give their own community members incentives to consume energy during the periods when it's being generated to avoid having to buy electricity from the system. Or they could be designing it so that they are storing it when it's not being used. One could imagine an as available product being offered by a retail supplier to its consumers, again, at a special price to reflect the fact that the electricity will be purchased in markets or from maybe renewable energy suppliers on a PPA contract. And I also want to mention the idea of a central auction. Currently, auctions do ask renewable generators to offer a price per kilowatt hour for energy generated when it is available. What is necessary now is to have a back-to-back set of contracts with retail suppliers, energy communities, or large consumers to buy the electricity from those renewable generators and to be receiving the same sorts of prices and incentives to consume when that energy is being produced. The government can provide financial support to make available, this sort of model attractive, and to finance, if you want, the pilots or the experiments that we're talking about, and to use the regulatory sandbox as a way to experiment with the two-market approach. By way of conclusion, then, I'd just like to say that I think it's clear that active consumers and citizens are essential for net zero emissions, that fundamental changes are underway in electricity, and the aim should be to let consumers drive the process rather than central decision makers. The aim of the proposed paradigm and the two-market design is to open the way for them to do so. Thank you very much.